Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Larry Parks Show. I'm Larry Parks, and tonight we have an amazing guest. His name is Adam Tooze. He's the Barton M. Biggs Professor of History at Yale University and the Director of International Security Studies at Yale University. He teaches all areas of modern German history, 20th century economic history, social theory, and the philosophy of history. Professor Tooze is perhaps the foremost historian on modern Germany. He's the author of Wages of Destruction, The Making and Breaking of the Nazi Economy, and Statistics in German and the German State, 1900 to 1945, The Making of Modern Economic Knowledge, myriad articles, reviews, and the recipient of several important academic prizes. He's with us this evening to discuss his magnificent The Deluge, The Great War, America, and the Remaking of the Global Order from 1916 to 1931. This book, by the way, folks, has been universally acclaimed as one of the most important books written on the interwar years. It was shortlisted for the Duff Cooper Prize and won both the Longman History Today Book of the Year Prize and the Wolfson Prize for History. Professor, thank you so very much for taking the trip down from Yale to see us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
It's a great honor to have you on the show. Before we get started, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about why you chose to write this magnificent book? What brought you to spend all this time on it?
Well, I'm fascinated by the question of America's power and its role in the world, and I have, as you said, written a book about Nazi Germany, which pivoted on the question of how, and the theme of how Hitler anticipated and attempted to forestall the rise of American power. And I saw that as really the red thread running through the history of the Nazi regime. That was Wages of Destruction. And I felt that having laid that thesis out there, I really had to kind of make good and show how this was an issue, a question not just for Germany and not just for the Nazi regime, but if you look around the world, for all of the major powers who have to come to terms with the fact that there's a new sheriff in town, there's a new all-important economic, military, financial presence and political presence in the world, and that's the United States. So it's really this abiding question for me of how the world has adjusted to the rise of a new superpower, the United States, in the early 20th century.
When you started this book, you started in 1916. Why didn't you start with 1914?
Well, that really is a way of posing the question right from the very beginning, because if you think about the crisis that brought Europe to the point of war and then over the edge of the cliff and into the terrible conflict of World War I in 1914, it's not just the case that America doesn't join the war. The remarkable thing is that America is no part of the conversation. America is no part of the diplomatic crisis in the summer of 1914. You can read thousands of pages on the diplomatic crisis of 1914 and you see that America barely figures in the calculations of Russia or Germany or France or Britain in 1914. And there's a remarkable transformation 2 years later, and which is where this book starts, when the entire world wakes up to the fact that the question of who is going to be elected American president, the doings of Wall Street or the Federal Reserve are absolutely decisive for the future of what starts out really as a European war or a war between Europe's empires all over the world. And so really that's, in that choice of date is already the argument of the book encapsulated, that we think of World War I as beginning in 1914 and ending in 1918, but that's already kind of a Eurocentric construction. From the point of view of the wider world, 1916 may be a rather more significant date.
I think that's right, and I think also, correct me if you don't think I have it right, but people really weren't paying that much attention to the United States, and even in the United States, the emphasis was on Europe. You buy that?
That's absolutely true. I mean, Britain is the first European nation to open a full embassy in the United States, I think in 1893 or 1894.
I didn't know that.
Up to that point, no significant European power had anything more than a consulate in Washington, D.C. So it is not by coincidence that America doesn't figure in 1914, as you're saying. Nobody was in the habit of taking American politics seriously, and the Europeans are really surprised and somewhat humiliated in 1916 to have to care about the American presidential election. So it was precisely to sort of capture the shock of this pivoting of world power that I chose to structure the book the way I did.
I think even in America wasn't paying attention to America. And so when they came to this notion of establishing a central bank, the Federal Reserve, the guy who was really the intellectual force behind that was Paul Warburg.
Yes.
Came from Germany.
Yes.
They were looking to model after the Germans.
I would agree with you. And when I say that the book is about the way in which the world adjusts to American power, ultimately, the most crucial question, it turns out, is how America itself adjusts to its power. And to that extent, this is really a story of disappointment and failure, in that in this first phase, the United States is very ill at ease with its own influence. It proves itself incapable of wielding its power and influence in a constructive way. And this turns out to be really the crux, the nub of the entire problem, is how America deals with its own influence.
And so what was happening on the front lines in 1916 that was most important to this book?
Well, the thing about World War I is that we imagine it always by way of the Western Front, which is a static stalemate, a sort of slogging match between two armies which are entrenched on either side of northwestern France and in Belgium. And that's a very, very deceiving image of World War I. World War I is a highly dynamic war which swings back and forth. It's as though you have two wrestlers who are sort of clinched together and nobody's moving, but there's a huge power play going on behind these essentially sort of locked bodies. And in 1916, it first seems as though Germany is going to win the war with an enormous military effort at Verdun. Then the initiative swings back decisively the other way with the British offensive on the Somme, and then even more importantly, the Russian offensive against Austria-Hungary, swinging Romania into the war, one of the last nations to join the war before the United States. So the war is hanging in the balance, and it's precisely that precariousness of the war that makes America so crucial.
You know, I was telling you before the show that what really got me interested in this book was research that I had done maybe 20 years ago on the connection with the financing of the war.
Yes.
And I mentioned to you a memo that's referenced in a book called America Goes to War by Tanisfeld. It came out in the Nye Commission, whereby J.P. Morgan was complaining in early 1915 that if they couldn't lay off the financing on the Fed, that they would have to stop. In your book, you deal with this. Talk about the connection with the Federal Reserve and J.P. Morgan and financing the war.
Really, from 1915 onwards, Britain, France and Russia are borrowing very large amounts of money from the United States.
How much money?
We're talking $2 billion really by the end of 1916 into early 1917, which in contemporary terms is a vast amount, far more than any American lender had lent abroad. When US Steel was launched, its bond issue was $300 million, which was an unprecedented private issue. So JP Morgan, on behalf of the governments of Europe, has launched a vast amount of bonds. The tolerance of the market is beginning to fray. Investors are beginning to pull back. And there is no question at this point that the outcome of the war in Europe, or at least the way in which Britain, France and Russia are going to be able to carry on this war, and these are societies and economies which are being strained to the max, it depends crucially on whether or not they will be able to access new borrowing in the United States. And what I think JP Morgan and other American strategists are realizing is that if this remains within the private markets and JP Morgan is leading Wall Street, then there is a finite amount that the Entente powers, Britain, France and Russia and Italy, are going to be able to borrow. And so this question of whether or not this can be transferred into public lending, so governmentally backed lending from the United States to the governments of Europe, is indeed the pivotal issue in 1916, 1917. And the governments of Europe do everything they can to try and enroll the American government in their war effort. And the solution, of course, by the summer of 1917 are Liberty Bonds, this unprecedented fundraising drive by the American state on behalf, in large part, of its European associates in the war. 1/3 of the revenue from the Liberty Bonds is channeled to Europe, largely to Britain, which then it further lends on to France, Italy and Russia.
Is it fair to say, in your view, that if America didn't come up with the funding, that they couldn't have continued with the war, they'd have to sue for peace?
I don't think it would have been quite as straightforward as that. It certainly would have enormously raised the pressure on Britain, France, Russia and Italy. After all, Germany fought the war largely from domestic resources, so it was possible for the European states to carry on this war But we should be alert to the consequences of that. Russia, after all, succumbs to revolution in 1917. Germany succumbs to revolution in 1918. So all of these societies are being put through a extraordinary, stressful period. And if they're not able to draw on resources from the outside, those stresses for many of them become too much and result in the state failure, the breakdown of political order.
So it really ruined these countries, just the financing part.
The financing part, given that these are societies at very modest levels of income by modern standards, $3,000–4,000 per annum GDP per capita in modern money. So we're talking lower middle income countries by modern standards. To finance a war of the scale of World War I from that level really means acute hardship for all of these societies. People are really going hungry, notably in Vienna and Berlin. People are starving. You see children with distended bellies. These are societies being pushed to the absolute limit. And so this issue is really a crash test of the viability of their political systems.
It makes me quiver just to think about the fact that the financing really made all this possible. Tell me, years ago I read speeches by Hitler where he blamed the war on the bankers. Mm-hmm. Was there any truth to that?
There is a deep perception on the part of the Germans that there is nothing more to the war than Anglo-American finance. The Germans are convinced, and this becomes a key part, after all, also of Hitler's conspiratorial views, that business interests entirely dominate American and British politics, and that is really the essence of the entire war. This was a struggle by resentful Brits who were worried about German competition and profit-seeking Americans against the righteous German nation defending its national honor. So this becomes, for the Germans, a really deep-seated understanding and interpretation, and it's largely on those grounds that they then also take the risk of launching the U-boat war, because they feel they have nothing to lose. They are wholly convinced that the Americans are bound to enter the war because JP Morgan is so extended, so committed to the war effort. And so really the best strategy for the Germans is to strike first and to strike hard and try to do something to intercept the deliveries of raw materials and food and weapons that the Americans are supplying and the Canadians are supplying to Britain, France and Russia, by means of the U-boat. But they do that on the assumption that American involvement in the war is essentially inevitable, underestimating, in my view, the extent to which they then become the essential trigger that drives America into the war. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy or a self-fulfilling conviction on the part of the Germans. They make America's entry into the war inevitable by believing that it is.
But you mentioned in your book, correct me if I don't have this right, that at one point the financing was so great, in order to get the money back, they had to win on this side.
I don't think there's any doubt that JP Morgan individually as a bank, and with it obviously a large part of Wall Street, would have been in serious jeopardy if the Entente had not won.
Right.
But that doesn't add up to that. 2 + 2 in this case doesn't immediately make 4. The mere fact that JP Morgan was so exposed did not drive Wilson into, an open-armed embrace of the Entente cause. To the horror of Wall Street and to the horror of JP Morgan, he in fact uses the Fed to try and stop any further lending, and all the evidence we have from inside the White House in early 1917 suggests that the president is being dragged screaming and kicking into the war, very much against his own political instincts and against his own political commitments. So my view is that this is an extraordinarily tense moment. Everything is in play, and it's the aggression of the German side that really hands the game to the pro-Entente, pro-war faction in the United States. The overwhelming majority, I think, of American opinion as late as the fall of 1916 is still very much in favour of America staying outside the war. The moral stakes in the war are very uncertain. Why would America want to go to war on the side of Imperial Russia? It's one thing to go to war on the side of liberal Britain and Republican France, who after all had donated the Statue of Liberty, but why America should go to war on the side of Tsarist Russia, which is deeply anti-Semitic, hugely reactionary, is very, very unclear. And so, to my mind, the Germans do Britain and France an enormous favour by unleashing the U-boats.
Sure. One of the things that comes to mind for me is how stuff gets on the national agenda.
Yeah.
Now, I think you make a very strong case that Wilson was indeed dragged into it. But one of the things that came up in that period was that, and this is not discussed in the book, is that the New York Times, for example, was always anti-war. But somehow they made the switch. And I have it in my mind, you can dispute this or correct me, that the New York Times sets the agenda. Could it be that the financial interests and all the people who are making all this money from the war got the New York Times somehow to change their stripes on it?
My sense is that it has more to do with public opinion, and that there's a sort of weird circular loop that gets going with a series of outrages perpetrated by the Germans. It starts with Lusitania, but that isn't quite enough. But the sort of rolling thunder of bad news that really stirs the anti-German opinion in early 1917 is irresistible. And I think it sweeps a lot of people off the fence or from one camp into the other in early 1917. You see this not just with establishment journals like New York Times, but something like the New Republic also suddenly finds itself in a pro-war position. Walter Lippmann, I would think of as the key witness here, who is, a first-rank progressive of the period before 1914, very ambiguous about the war early on, and then from the spring of 1917 becomes one of the architects of the publicity efforts and one of the real engineers. And he is deeply concerned about this running out of control of grassroots Germanophobia, of grassroots xenophobic, ultra-American patriotism running out of control of the Wilson administration, which is indeed what happens by 1918. But I think this is something that really is clearly being manipulated. Many people are trying to manipulate this flow of public opinion, but it has an eerie life of its own, which somebody like Walter Lippmann will then spend the rest of his life trying to analyze and diagnose.
Yeah, that's another topic. It deserves a lot of discussion, but I want to go on to something else. So you talk in the book how the financial shifted from London to New York. What was involved in this shift? So it used to be that the British Empire was really the financial hegemon for the world,
yes,
and somehow it shifted. Talk to that issue.
Yes, I mean, we were saying a minute ago that nobody has an embassy in Washington until the 1890s. America does not have a central bank that can correspond with the Bank of France or the Bank of England until 1913. So up to that point, the United States is very much a sort of peripheral member of the global financial system. It's a recipient of huge amounts of private investment from the money centers in Europe, but it is not itself a major strategic financial actor. And it is the war that transforms America's position in this respect more dramatically than in any other. In a matter of literally, well, you can count it almost in months, but we're talking about really the space of time between 1913, when the Fed is established, and the early 1920s, when the Treasury, the US Treasury, the Wall Street banks, and the Federal Reserve become the dominant actors of the global financial system. And the crucial shift, in my view, is not in fact in the first instance private lending, but this highly politicized lending by the US Treasury that is set in motion from the summer of 1917. So the US Treasury's Liberty Bond program, which channels money not to private borrowers in Europe, but to the governments of Europe. So we're talking really about government-to-government lending between the richest countries in the world, between democracies as well, which makes this all the more explosive. Think of the Eurozone crisis now. That's really the mechanism through which America establishes very quickly something that one would have to describe as hegemony, because America acquires the capacity to exercise leverage, not over small Central American countries, not over Cuba, not over Costa Rica, not over Panama, it can send the Marines in there, but over Paris, over London, over Tokyo, over the real heartland, the major centers of military power, who all of a sudden have to bargain with Washington about, say, naval disarmament, while simultaneously having to bargain with Washington about $3 or $4 billion that they owe in war loans in the case of France. And that establishes a direct connection between finance and military power, the likes of which we had not even seen before 1914. You rightly say that London is the hegemon before 1914, but it wasn't a hegemon in the sense that America becomes by the 1920s. Britain never strong-armed Paris to reduce the size of its navy before 1914 whilst squeezing its access to government loans. Right? That sort of a pattern of exercise of power is distinctively American, and it really comes to the fore in the 1920s, and arguably it extends all the way down to the 1970s, the era of Vietnam, Nixon, and the breakdown of Bretton Woods. But through the 1940s, 50s and 60s, this is the standard MO of American power, that financial power, political leverage, public opinion as a major influence, and military power all harnessed together in a package.
You know, one of the things which you cover in your book about the legacy of this period is that the Americans always expected to be paid back. Talk to that issue. I mean, the other guys were looking to somehow forgive loans, but the United States, tell our viewers a little bit about that.
Well, it's one of the sort of legacies of the Liberty Bond program, is that this is politicized all the way down. So as part of the war mobilization in the United States, the Wilson administration organized a huge public mobilization in which tens of millions of American households committed their savings to the war effort. Now, that debt is very difficult to default on, because basically you're going to be taking that out of the pocketbooks of tens of millions of American families. Of course, notionally, one could structure this in lots of different ways. The American taxpayer could take responsibility for money owed to tens of millions of households. One way or another, this is a political hot potato of the first order. So there are very few people who, in Congress, would turn a blind eye to this happening. Now, the administration, the Harding administration in 1921, offers Congress a deal under which Congress would delegate to the executive branch the right to do strategic debt bargains, but Congress says no dice. There's no way we're going to permit you to do this. We've just voted down Wilson's League of Nations proposal. We're not going to hand off the control of financial policy to the Harding administration. So instead they establish a committee which exercises very direct control over the war debt deals which are made throughout the 1920s. So this is something which is hugely politicized and is understood at the time as directly affecting millions of ordinary American savers. It's far more direct, I think, the entanglement than you see in the Marshall Plan era, where nobody really is very clear about who it was that paid for the Marshall aid. Clearly, in the end, it's the American taxpayer, but there isn't this one-to-one relationship that you see in the era of the Liberty Bonds. And that makes it very difficult for the Americans to make any concessions on principle, right, on the actual sum that's owing. In fairness to America, one should, of course, concede that what they do is stretch the repayment terms, reducing the net present value of the loans. In other words, essentially making rather substantial concessions to the British, the French, and the other borrowers. But it's a hugely politicised issue, and there are moments in 1926 when anti-American feeling over this issue is running so high in Paris that American bankers and other visitors to the capital are warned to stay away from Paris, because if you're heard to be speaking American accented English in Paris in the summer of 26, you're likely to run into some rather unpleasant encounters with the locals, who argue that hundreds of thousands of their boys have laid down their lives for the common cause, and the Americans want their money back.
Sure. You know, one of the reasons why, it's not in the book, but this comes into my area, one of the reasons why the United States was so successful with these Liberty Bonds is that the Liberty Bonds had a gold clause.
Yeah.
Supposed to pay you off in gold. And later on in 1933, President Roosevelt abrogated the gold clause. And as a matter of fact, they screwed all these people who had these Liberty Bonds.
And in practice, it turns out that much of the money that people invested in Liberty Bonds was not actually the little old lady's savings account. People invested in them by borrowing money. So they were actually financed through debt. So the extraordinary thing is that the American population does not save a great deal during World War I. Consumption remains at quite high levels. So in practice, all that really would have been entailed in writing this stuff off is writing off bank finance debt. It could have just been a collective deleveraging. But in the politics of the Liberty Bonds, it's always the little old lady, the kid, the school kid who's put their piggy bank money, the hard-working blue-collar household who've contributed the funds.
There was plenty of that too.
There was plenty of that too.
Plus they had to be paid in gold, is my point.
Yeah.
And which means you had to actually get the gold. It wasn't a matter of printing this stuff up.
Yeah.
Talk about the vulnerability of the credited nations to the debts that were owed by Germany. This is after the war.
Yes.
I mean, they thought they were going to get all their money back.
Yes.
Talk to that issue. That's a big
one of
issue.
the ironies of the war is that Germany emerges without large quantities of debt owing to any foreigners. And the debts that the Germans did owe to themselves were largely written down by the inflation. So the money that Germany ends up owing initially is reparations debt owed by the German government on behalf of the German people to Britain and France. And the essence of the stabilization that's put in place in the 1920s is to add, not to write reparations off, but if you like, to counterbalance reparations with another debt also contracted by Germany. And this is crucially private lending by America to Germany. And this is a huge wrench. It's not self-evident to Wall Street that it should lend to Germany. It's burdened by reparations. It was the former enemy. There's a lot of Republican Yankee opinion, which is highly Germanophobic from 1918 onwards. And yet, after 1924, through the Dawes deal, in which JP Morgan is, as it were, the key architect of the financing through Wall Street becomes a channel through which vast amounts of money is channeled into Germany from American lenders. Again, we're talking billions. And these are then at stake in 1929, 1930, when the global economy goes south, the Great Depression strikes. And what you have is a queue of creditors, classic bankruptcy situation, a queue of creditors, as it were, in a line in Berlin. And the crucial issue is who is going to be paid. Is it going to be the reparations creditors who are paid by Germany? Is it going to be the banking houses in the Netherlands or in Switzerland or in the City of London who finance short-term German imports, for instance? All of Germany's food and raw materials are financed by European banks on short-term basis. Or is it going to be Wall Street with long-term investments in German infrastructure, public utilities, in municipal bonds, who have pumped money into Germany since 1924. And the game that is played out after 1929 as the Depression strikes is which one of those creditor groups is going to be paid.
Yeah, talk about the connection with all this and the Great Depression.
Right. So the Great Depression is in large part, in the German case, triggered by the ending of lending. So throughout the 1920s, the Germans didn't live high on the hog, but they had a higher than expected standard of living, which was subsidized, sustained by borrowing. They ran trade deficits and they simultaneously paid reparations, and they financed both the imports and the reparations by borrowing money, and they borrowed that largely from the United States. In 1928-29, in the last final ramp-up of the Wall Street boom that explodes in 1929, interest rates in the United States start rising, American money starts flowing back into the United States, and all of a sudden the Germans face the need for a massive adjustment of their current account. They need to reduce imports, they need to raise exports, and this produces a downward torque, a deceleration of the German economic metabolism. They shrink domestic demand, government taxes go up, interest rates go up, government spending goes down. The entire German economy begins to grind to a halt. It's a deflationary scenario we're painfully aware of today, and that's then compounded by bank failures which begin to ruin the heartland of German finance from the summer of 1931 onwards. And it's in that situation then that the Hoover regime, the Hoover administration, declares the moratorium, the famous moratorium, which cancels political debts in the first instance. So that cancels the money that Britain and France owe to the United States, and it cancels the reparations that Germany owes to Britain and France. The strategic interest from the point of view of the United States at that moment is to rescue Wall Street and to protect Wall Street from taking a further hit, which Wall Street could very ill afford to do in the summer of 1931. So what America does, what the Hoover administration manages to do in that queue of creditors, is to shove the reparations creditors to the back and put the Wall Street lenders to the front of that queue.
That's covered very nicely in your book. We only have a couple of minutes left. Very quickly, what do you think the most important legacy of World War I is today?
I think, interestingly, we see it not in Europe, and not really on the transatlantic axis, but above all in East Asia. If you want to understand the kind of resentments, the terrifying level of aggression and resentment between China and Japan, which are a major part of this book. I started out as a European historian, but ended up writing this global history. If you want to understand the level of animosity between Japan and China, you really have to go back to this moment. This is the moment where China really becomes the victim of Japanese imperialism on a really flagrant, to a really flagrant extent. This is the moment when the Chinese feel victimized by the failure of the United States and the European powers to shield China against Japanese aggression. So that, for me, is really it's perhaps sort of an unexpected, a sort of left field kind of answer, but I think that for me is really the moment where we see in day-to-day politics the legacies of World War I still rumbling down to the present.
That's really fascinating, and I have a lot more stuff that I'd like to ask you about, but we've run out of time.
Thank you very much.
Folks, this ends the Larry Park Show for this evening. We've been very privileged and happy to have as a guest Professor Adam Tooze from Yale, and we've been talking about his magnificent book, The Deluge, The Great War, America and the Remaking of the Global Order from 1916 to 1931. This is a fascinating read for those of you who are interested in history. So again, Professor, thank you so much for coming on the show. Folks, thank you so much for watching, and please do tune in again next week, and good night, and God bless.